Good morning, Aalborg. Good morning, Denmark. You won't believe this, but I am on my way from Aarhus, but via New York. Because last week I had the pleasure with the mayor of Aarhus, the mayor of Vejle, spending some time here. I had to be back in the city over the weekend, so I ran home and then came back here. I suggest if you go from Aarhus to Aalborg that you don't go through New York. It's much quicker to come directly. But I am glad to be back in Denmark for the second time in about five days, particularly with a group of men and women who are involved in the governance of the municipalities of Denmark. Denmark is a special place, and in a way, some of the things I want to say do not apply here because Denmark as a nation is smaller than many, many cities. It's about half the size of New York. It's about a sixth of the size of Chongqing, China. And in a certain sense, one of the reasons Denmark is such an efficient nation, even though I don't think nations are very efficient, is because it does have the small scale of a large municipality. The same is true in Holland, in Switzerland, and some other smaller countries where the cities play a prominent role, but where the national governments are very much rooted in the municipalities. And it doesn't surprise me that this local government Denmark association is a crucial association for Denmark because this is truly a land of cities and towns and villages and municipalities. And what I want to talk to you about today is something really that you know. In a way, I want to hold a mirror up to you. I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know, but I hope you will have a smile of recognition when I say some things about the role of cities in the modern world, and when I provide a little context, a little background for why cities have become so very important today, not just in Denmark or in Europe or in North America, but all around the world, and why, therefore, I think there is a powerful argument, not just polemical, not just rhetorical, to suggest that cities and their mayors and their citizens have not just a need and a responsibility to govern the world, but a right to govern the world in the name of democratic self-government in a world where nation states and international organizations are simply not addressing the crucial problems that face the planet. And that's really the dilemma we start with. We start here, in fact, in Europe, the birth of the nation state in the 16th, 15th, and 16th century, l'État-nation, the idea of a national state, a state organized around a territory, a people, and around sovereignty. We start with that idea of a political unit that for 400 years was very, very effective. Because for the last 400 years in Europe and around the world, the nation has been the right scale for a people, for a territory. When I was growing up in the 1940s in New York City, the United States was very much a territorial nation separated by its oceans from the world. Most of the problems we faced in the United States were inside the jurisdiction of the United States. When I was a boy, my mother used to say to me, I lived in Manhattan, and she said, don't go to New Jersey, there's a virus over there, you might get sick. I still live in Manhattan. I don't worry about the New Jersey virus. I do worry about Mexican pig flu and Hong Kong flu and HIV and the new pandemic plagues that circle the globe in a week or two, Ebola, that suddenly becomes a threat not just in parts of Africa, but around the world. We live in a global world of health pandemics where national health systems are no longer the answer. My first car in the 1950s was a good American car, Chevrolet. Today I drive a BMW, and you might say that's not very patriotic. But my BMW is made in South Carolina with 60% American parts. Most Chevrolets are made in Mexico with 70% foreign parts. So which is the American car, the BMW or the Chevrolet? In a way, it's silly to talk about national identities with automobiles or other things. Apple is coming to Viborg here to build a data plant, I guess servers and so on. Apple is technically an American company, but of course, like all other global communication and digital companies, it is a global company because we live in a world of global markets. We live in a world of global climate change. It's nice and warm right now in Aalborg, but I don't think you have a problem of Aalborg warming, or Danish warming, or European warming. It's global warming. The climate is a global issue, and nation states are not suited to deal with it. So these territorial, jurisdictional nations that for 400 years have governed us are increasingly unable to deal with the transnational, global, interdependent challenges of the 21st century. Whether we talk about climate or markets or immigration, we're talking today about refugees and integration, but of course the massive movement of people in the modern world is about movement of people looking for jobs. The logic of the economy is global. And the people who are here, that we call immigrants, are here looking for jobs. They are still governed by your national borders, but the economic globe has no borders. It's a global economy. So in my country, we have 12 million undocumented workers, 12 million, twice the size of your population, who are there illegally with respect to American law, but completely legally with respect to the logic of the global economy. And the Mexicans who come to America are no different than the Guatemalans who come to Mexico looking for jobs. And the sub-Saharan Africans who go to Morocco looking for jobs are no different than the Moroccans who go to Spain and those who go from Spain into the Schengen countries without visas looking for jobs. Because again, the economy is global. So we have a global environment, we have a global economy, we have a global technology, we have global terrorism. Al-Qaeda is the first malevolent, malicious NGO, non-governmental organization. It understands that it is without borders. The reason we have a hard time fighting is that it has no national address. It doesn't belong to any one country. It's global in character. Terrorism is a global problem, a cross-border problem. And the American Navy and the American Air Force, the most powerful in the world, are no match for terrorism because a B-1 bomber can do nothing against a suicide bomber. It's asymmetrical warfare in a new global world. So here is our dilemma in the 21st century. We still live in a world of nation states divided by territory, borders, monocultural populations, the French nation, the Danish nation, the Japanese nation, in a world that is interdependent, transnational, and global in character, which means every major challenge we face today, global and interdependent, is responded to by independent, sovereign, territorial nations that don't really know how to cooperate together, and so just don't do it. And as a result, the major problems of the world are largely unaddressed, and that has created a crisis both in dealing with environment, dealing with terrorism, dealing with immigration, dealing with global corporations, dealing with global technology, but it has also created a crisis in governance. Because the primary governance institutions, these national institutions, national governments, simply cannot deal with these problems, nor can the international institutions that they contrived, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the United Nations, deal with them because those are nation-state based. The G8, the G20, the G50. How many there are doesn't matter because they are sovereign, independent nations that don't really work very well together. And all we need to do is look at the Middle East, look at Ukraine, Look at the failure for 21 years of the COP process, the United Nations process on climate. You had your experience in Copenhagen here in COP 15, which like every other year brought 185 nations to a capital, to Lima. It was Copenhagen for COP 15. The nations came, they sat down, they said, we face an urgent problem, and then they explained why they couldn't do anything about it, and they went home. But Copenhagen was a lesson, because mayors also came to Copenhagen, not just national governments. And the mayors stayed, and the mayors talked, and the mayors had already had an organization called ICLE, the Environmental Issues Organization, that has been here for 25 or 30 years. And right a few years before Copenhagen, Ken Livingston had started an organization called the C20 Climate Cities that became, with Mayor Bloomberg, the C40 Climate Cities. And cities said, whether or not nations solve this problem, we have to deal with it. Because the world cities sit on water. 90% of the world's cities, 9 out of 10 cities are on water. Seas, lakes, or rivers, which means the cities will be the first, like New Orleans, like New York after Sandy, will be the first to pay the price of sea rise and global change. Cities know they can't wait for foolish nations to explain why they can't do anything. They have to act, and they have to act now. They have a responsibility to act, but they also have a right to act. And I want to be very clear, when I say mayors should govern the world, it's not polemics, it's not rhetoric. I am talking about the right to self-government that the political institutions that represent more than half the population of the world have. Cities today are about 52% of the world population. In Europe, it's 75 or 80%. In North America, 75 or 80% of the population are in cities and metro regions. Cities represent and generate 80% of global GDP, 80%. Next time Mayor Hidalgo of Paris has an argument with Hollande about resources, next time a Dutch mayor talks to the Commissioner of the Regions in Brussels about resources, next time Aalborg or Aarhus or Weil has a problem with resources from the national government in Copenhagen, perhaps they ought to remind those national governments that they generate the wealth that the nations take and then give back like a gift. The arrows go the wrong way. The arrows economically don't go top down, they go bottom up. The cities generate the wealth. The nations use it and give some back. Cities have a right to enough wealth to solve their problems and deal with their things, particularly when the nations don't do it. So cities are in a position today to begin to do what nations and states don't. Jean Monnet made it very clear towards the end of World War II, and he said the problem with the nation state, he was thinking about a new European experiment that became the European Union. He said states are too big for participation and too small for power. You know, they're just too large for people really to feel that they're participating at that level, but they're still too small for the global levers of power. They don't really work very well, which is why his dream was a dream of Europe, and that was a noble experiment, faltering a little, but still in its idea of pooled sovereignty important. But the problem, I think, with Europe is it started with the wrong idea. It started with the idea that the nations are the core of Europe, so let's create a European Union of nations. Whereas, in fact, it's the regions and the cities of Europe and the world that are the essential units. And they are the ones that need to be empowered. They are the ones that need to cooperate and work together, as this association does within Denmark, but I am suggesting as cities around the world need to do with one another across borders as well. because the problems are global. The problems are global, and local government, it turns out, in solving local problems, is also solving global problems. Interestingly, the nation state often has a hard time understanding both the locality and the globe. But because urban problems are global problems, immigration, climate change, air, water, industry, jobs, immigrants, those are also the problems of the globe. And so when cities talk together, as they do in this association and others like it, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the Mexican Conference of Mayors, other municipal associations, they find themselves talking about local problems, but they also find themselves talking about global problems. Why are cities so good at this and nations so bad? Well, the first thing to recognize, and this is a very important thing for national officials to understand, I think in Denmark they do understand it, but in Europe at large I don't think they do. I learned this when I was last year in Brussels. I was sitting on a podium like this in front of a large audience with Commissioner Hahn, the Commissioner of the Regions and Cities, and he was saying, the way sometimes Brussels bureaucrats do, I recognize that cities are important, he said. They are an important level of government. An important level of government. I said to Commissioner Hahn on the podium, I actually think that's wrong, Commissioner Hahn. Cities are not another level of government, like the region, like the province, like the state, like Europe at large. Cities are the quintessential human communities. They define our sociability. They make us human in the sense that Aristotle talked about as a political animal. We live in the polis. We are at home in communities. We come together. Urbanization is not a feature of the last 10 or 20 years. It's a feature of 5,000 years of human civilization on every continent in the world. Human beings were born to come together. They like each other. Sociability, being together in neighborhoods, density, friction, living next to one another. We crave that. And that's why cities become the defining human communities. The cities and towns define what? Where we are born, where we grow up, where we go to school, we get married, where we work, we play, we pray, we get old and we die. We identify with our cities. You might say when you're traveling abroad, I'm from Denmark, but when you think about yourself, you think I'm from Odense, I'm from Aarhus, I'm from Copenhagen. You think of the place where you were born, where your family is, where your company is, where your church is, where your mosque is. Because that's what the human community is about. So we mistake, I'm a political scientist, but we make a mistake when we think cities are just another level of government. We've got cities, we've got provinces, we've got cantons, we've got the Länder, we've got states, we have international organizations. Cities are not part of that political science administrative curriculum. They are who we are. They define us. And that's why being mayor of a city or an alderman or a city councilor of a city is different than being a governor of a state or a president or prime minister of a country. Because when you govern a city, you are taking responsibility for your neighbors. You are taking responsibility for the quintessential human community. And that community has to work. It has to function. 2 times in the last 2 years, the great powerful government of the United States of America closed its doors for a week because of a Republican Congress that refused to do business. The national government of the United States closed its doors, stopped. Well, the first amazing thing is nobody noticed. But the second is, of course, life went on because life went on in the cities. I think it's even possible, very improbable, it's possible that at some point in a political argument in the national parliament here, in the national government might be paralyzed. But imagine now that the mayor of Aalborg says, today Aalborg is closed. No police, no fire, no schools, no sewers, no garbage collection, no snow shoveling. The city is closed. You can't do it. Cities have never closed, not in thousands of years. Even in the Middle Ages, during siege and plague, you can't close cities because that's where the everyday life goes on. That's what government is really about, facilitating our lives from days to days, and that's what mayors have to do. And that means mayors must, first of all, be pragmatists. I know political parties are represented in this room, as in any organization, but I also know at the level of the city, those parties are much less important, the ideological differences much less important than at the national and the international level. Because as a mayor of New York said a long time ago, there's no Democratic or Republican way to pick up the garbage. You pick it up or you don't pick it up. And if you don't pick it up, I don't care what party you're from, you're not going to be elected next time. The mayor of New York, the new mayor of New York, is a good guy. He's a very progressive guy. The Social Democrats in the room will probably like him. I like him. But the first 3 months last winter when he became mayor, he wanted to talk about preschool education and affordable housing, but we had three major snowstorms in a row. And all he could talk about was shoveling the snow. Because again, that's what mayors have to do. They have to, first of all, take care of fundamental services that make up government, and that makes them pragmatists. There's a wonderful story about Teddy Kollek. Teddy Kollek was the mayor of Jerusalem in the 1980s. And back then, as now, Jerusalem was a theater of religious politics. And every week, Mayor Kollek had to receive in his offices imams from the Muslim community, rabbis from the Jewish community, and Christian prelates from the Christian community. And every week they argued with him and told him they gave the narratives that justified their access to the holy sites. And then as now, the question, who has access and when to the various holy sites that the three great religions of Abraham share in Jerusalem. And finally one day, Teddy Kollek turned to the men who were preaching at him and preaching at him and preaching at him, and he said, "Gentlemen, gentlemen, spare me your sermons, and I will fix your sewers." Well, that's in a way what mayors say to the political guys, the ideologues. Spare me your sermons about socialism and about the private market, and I will make the buses run. I will help fix the city's sewers. I will make sure this is a community where everybody has a job, where our kids have decent schools, where there is health care for all. And I won't worry too much about the grand ideologies. I won't stand on principle and do nothing about the problems. That's what's happening in the United States today. We have politicians who are standing on principle. I don't like government, so I will stop government from doing anything at all. And that's possible at the national level. That is not possible in cities. Mayors cannot do it. And when I talk about mayors, I talk about the emblems and symbols of cities, but of course I mean not just the mayors, but the councilors, the aldermen, the district leaders, and most important, the citizens. Because mayors understand better than most politicians that without the support of the community, the business community, the civic community, the educational community, and of citizens around the town, they cannot govern. There's a great etymology, cité and citoyen, city and citizen, same root. When we talk about citizens, we're talking about people who live in cities in the origin, in the original meaning. And citizens are key to the city. And that's why a flourishing city cannot just be a well-governed city. It has to be a city in which business and civil society and the cultural institutions and the universities and schools participate every day in helping the city to flourish, not just in their separate jobs, but as citizens. And that also means that cities have a special responsibility when it comes to issues of integration, about which the minister just talked a few minutes ago, and which we know is a particular problem. We know what's happened in Copenhagen and in Paris and in the London subways and in the Madrid train stations. We know that issues of integration are related, we're not quite sure how, but are related to issues of terrorism. We know that acts of terror are done violently, irrationally, and wrongly, but in the name of the lack of integration, a sense that the communities have not come together. And that's a problem for the cities, because nations, Denmark is the Danish nation, but Copenhagen and Aarhus are multicultural cities. Diversity is a feature of cities everywhere and always has been. The nation state is monocultural, cities are multicultural, and cities have to deal with that issue. And I have a couple of quick points I just want to make. I had a wonderful visit in Aarhus. The city architect and planner took me to Vestmarkt, which is right outside Aarhus, where they have opened a souk in an old marketplace that actually is a bazaar, and it's decorated. You could be in Algiers, you could be in Damascus. It's a marvelous way in which the new communities, some of them are not so new, some of them have been there generations, they still feel new, but they shouldn't. But they have created their own communities, their own shopping, in such an exciting and nice way that a lot of people from Aarhus now go shopping there every weekend, because it's almost like going to another place. Well, here is the lesson I think I learned from Vestmarkt, and that you should learn too. The issue is not what can you do for the immigrants and how can you assimilate them. The issue is how can you take advantage of what the immigrants bring to this society. It's not a paternalism. Don't do it for them. What can they do for Denmark? And the answer is a lot. Europe is suffering from population decline. We know that. And it's people who look like me who are causing population decline. We're getting old and we're not reproducing enough. In the United States of America, we're one of the few developing countries that's still growing fast. Why? Latino immigrants, Asian immigrants. They help the birth rate. They help keep a society young. But much more importantly than that, they bring their diversity, they bring their cultures, and they enrich and diversify Denmark. As a young man, I learned stories of what the Danes did in World War II. We all know those stories, remarkable stories. When Jews were being persecuted, Danes put a Star of David on all of them and said, "We too are Jews." We are all Jews, in effect. Much the way in Paris today they say, "We are Charlie. We are all Charlie. We are Jews." That was a beautiful thing, and it made a striking difference in Europe in those dark days. I would love to see a Denmark that said, "We are all Danes, but we are all Turks. We are all Danes, but we are all Syrians. We are all Danes, but we are all Muslims and Arabs." That is also our identity. I would love to see the equivalent of a Star of David that people put on their lapels that said, "We are all one," whether Danish or Muslim or Turkish or Syrian. Because that would be not just a good thing for assimilation and for the immigrants, it would be a great thing for Denmark, too. I said to a friend, "I love this country, but it's a little uptight, and the immigrants could help loosen things up a little in a very good way." So, cities are a special kind of community, they have a special kind of government, and I believe it is time now that they begin to work together with one another across borders to begin to deal with the global problems that we are facing across borders. Let it be said, there are already a great many networks of cities out there working together. The original subtitle of my book was "If Mayors Ruled the World, Why They Should and How They Already Do." Because there are so many city networks and intercity networks that have been at work for a very long time. In this room, you probably know the UCLG, yes? Put up your hand if you recognize the United Cities and Local Governments. Not so many. It's the most important organization in the world nobody's ever heard of, is the way I put it. If I say how many have heard of the United Nations, we all know. How many have heard of the European Union? We all know. Even ignorant Americans can answer those questions. But smart Europeans don't know that for 100 years, Europe has had an organization called United Cities and Local Governments that has allowed cities across Europe and across the world to meet and talk and exchange practices with one another. And of course, there are dozens of others: Euro Cities, Energy Cities Europe, EFUS, the European Forum on Urban Security, which allows cities to share issues around security, CityNet in Asia, City Protocol in Barcelona, which is a common online network of cities for sharing. So in fact, cities are already engaged, not just within nations like this one, but between nations in cross-border activity. But here's what's missing. Here's the, if I can put it that way, the dirty little secret of nation states. They know that while cities associate and collaborate and cooperate and share practices, it's the nation states that exercise power. I'm a political scientist, and I'll tell you, politics is about power, not just responsibility. Politics is about power, not just rights. Politics is about power, not just democracy. Democracy is a way of legitimizing power. But politics is about the power to make change, the power to act collectively. And while cities have extraordinary responsibilities, and they've shown an extraordinary capacity for self-government, they don't have anywhere near the power that their numbers and their economic force represent in the world, and they need it now. And they can't get it just by mutual associations like this, or ICLE, or the UCLG. They need a political organization where they can unite and pool their power. Just as Europe pooled the sovereignty of the nations that had fought each other for 300 or 400 years, cities need to pool their energy, their resources, their power, their democratic legitimacy, and work together across borders. Hopefully, as here in Denmark, with the collaboration of the nation states to which they belong. But where nation states refuse to collaborate, where they stand in the way, then against the nation states that stand in the way. Because if a nation says a city does not have a right to deal with climate change, even though we're not going to do it, if a state says a city has no right to give a visa to immigrants unless we give a visa, and then gives no visa despite the fact that there are millions of immigrants in the city, then the city has a right to say, we will do it, and we will find the jurisdictional authority to do it, and we'll find the power to do it by working together with other cities around the world, because we generate the world's resources. We are a majority of the world's population, and we have a right to see our problems solved for everyone. Because when cities solve their problems of climate, of immigration, of security, of transportation, everybody benefits. Right now in Denmark and around Europe and around the world, there are a lot of people who are what we political scientists call free riders on the work of cities. The city creates a transportation system. A city creates jobs. The city has museums and educational institutions. It provides places to work for a whole region. The region takes advantage of all of that, but often pays little or no tax towards the upkeep of such services. That's the problem of Detroit. When I say cities should rule the world, people say, well, what about Detroit? This great American city that's bankrupt. Detroit is an interesting story. In 1950, Detroit, Michigan was the 4th largest city in the United States. 2 million people. It was one of the richest cities in the United States. The automotive industry was all in Detroit. Today, 67 years later, Detroit has not 2 million, but 650,000. It's lost 2/3 of its population. Almost all of the automotive industry has left Detroit. Half the parks are closed, 3/4 of the schools, a lot of the housing is empty. The city went bankrupt, as you know. And people say so much for the city. But let me tell you something. While that was happening to Detroit, the 10 counties immediately around Detroit, which are the greater Detroit metro region, went from 3 million to 5 million. And more than half of the auto industry that left downtown Detroit moved to the 10 counties around Detroit. They didn't go far away. They didn't go to South Carolina or Europe or Mexico. They went to the 10 counties around it. And those 10 counties are today one of the richest new tech economic zones in the United States, whose people are very, very wealthy. But they pay no taxes to Detroit. They pay nothing for the transportation infrastructure. They pay nothing for the great Detroit museums. A year ago, the people who were overseeing the bankruptcy said, we are going to sell the collection of the Detroit Art Museum, which is one of the great art museums of the world. And the people in the 10 counties said, you can't do that. That's our museum. Well, that's true. It was their museum, but they didn't pay a cent for it. But then they didn't want the collection sold. So we need a world not just of cities, but a world of metro regions. We need cities that include the regions around them. We need cities that, as has happened in Italy today, genuinely represent the real demographic and economic realities of metro regions. About a year ago, a little more than a year ago, I was in Florence. And the mayor of Florence then was a man named Matteo Renzi. He was the mayor of Florence. And he had just read my book, and we talked together. And he said to me, this has been a very interesting conversation. I'm afraid I have to go to Rome today, so I have to leave. And I said, why are you going to Rome? He said, I think they want to make me prime minister. And as you know, they did. And the first thing he did, and the most successful thing he did, Italy still has, we know, a lot of economic problems. It's part of that southern tier, and it's part of the European economic crisis and the euro crisis. But the one thing he was able to do was to transform the Senate constitutionally. And today, the Italian Senate represents not 15 or 18 old Italian provinces from the Middle Ages, but it represents 9 metro regions around Bologna, around Milano, around Palermo, around Rome, around Genoa, which now are not just the cities, but the regions around them into the countryside. So that Italy finally has a constitution that recognizes the real economic and political character of the Italian nation, which is metro regions. And really, my book should be called not If Cities or Mayors Rule the World, but If Metro Regions Rule the World, because the metro regions integrate and include not just the suburbs and exurbs, but even the agricultural zones around them. My wife in New York City buys almost all of our vegetables from local Hudson River farms. It's almost like the Middle Ages in America. Many big cities now have farming products from the local farms around them, not from the big agribusiness corporations, but from local farming that are integrated and are part of the community. So metro regions is the way in the future in which cities can thrive, incorporating and including and getting tax revenues from those communities and populations that they serve, and giving those populations genuine representation in the cities. So we live then in a world today of cities, of urbanization, but where cities are not permitted to exercise the power to meet their problems. At the end of If Mayors Rule the World, I proposed what 2 years ago seemed a kind of wild idea, a global parliament of mayors that would allow mayors and cities to meet regularly the way the United Nations does, but not just to share practices and share information, but to enact legislation and pursue common policy and exercise common muscle together, to exercise real power in facing the problems that the world faces. To my surprise and pleasure, a great many mayors and cities responded by saying, let's do it. October 23rd and 24th in London and Bristol, a big city and a moderate city, the first inaugural founding meeting of the Global Parliament of Mayors will take place. And cities, about 125 cities from all 5 continents, from 150,000 to 20 or 30 million people will be present. I hope a number of cities from Denmark will be present. The mayor of Aarhus has said he will consider it. I hope he will join us. Mayor Jensen, I know, is aware of it. I hope he will join us. We want cities from every nation in the world to participate in this founding exercise, not another conference, not another talkathon, but a place where cities can begin to act together to solve the problems that nations can't and won't. We also are working with associations like this one, the local cities leagues in America, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the Mexican Conference of Mayors, the Japanese Conference of Mayors, because those organizations that represent cities and municipalities are absolutely key to solving the problems that we face. So we are on the threshold of a governance revolution. We are on the threshold of an opportunity for cities to exercise their right to self-government in the face of the failure of nations to act. Our first theme will be climate. I go next month to Hong Kong to meet with the Nobel Laureates Climate Symposium. They are working with us, so is the C40, working with us to develop a climate manifesto for cities. We hope it will be adopted in Paris, in London and Bristol, and we hope it will be taken to Paris at the COP21 meeting. But the message in Paris at the UN in the end of the year will not be, here's something we would like you to do. It will be, here is what cities are doing. I hope you do it too, but whether or not you do it, we will. And with that climate manifesto, cities will be in a position to take firm action. And by the way, you know that cities generate 80% of carbon emissions and greenhouse gases. So it's both their responsibility, but also their capacity to do it. If cities take care of climate emissions, it doesn't matter what China or the United States or India do, if the world cities do it, because that's where the greenhouse gases are coming from. So cities are going to have the opportunity to do this in the coming fall. So there we have it. You all represent and are part of a movement of cities, the urbanized Denmark, part of a Europe that is a Europe of cities, and you sit on responsibilities and face challenges that cities can and will deal with. But the wonderful thing, too, about cities, and I want to end my comments here, which leaves us a few minutes for some questions from the moderator. The wonderful thing about the cities movement is it doesn't just renew the hope for governance and effective administration. It renews the hope for democracy. I've spent 50 years studying and thinking about democracy and self-government, and in the years since World War II, things have gotten worse and worse and worse. More countries are called democratic, but fewer of the democracies actually govern democratically. In my country, in the United States, less than half the population participate in most elections, and those who need to vote most, the young, women, people of color, vote least. So democracy is not working well. We saw in the Arab Spring a democracy movement that went straight to winter without ever coming to summer. We've seen the failure of democracy. We've seen cynicism about democracy from so many people. But cities are where democracy works. Cities are where liberty begins. When Alexis de Tocqueville went to the United States in the 1830s, he toured the towns, and the most important sentence in his book, Democracy in America, is this. He said, "Liberty is local." Liberty is local. Freedom starts in the fabric of democracy that is our urban communities, and it grows up from there. And this is reflected today in the fact that even in the most cynical countries where people don't trust their national governments, they still trust their mayors. In the United States, less than 40% of people trust the president. Less than 30% of the people trust the Supreme Court. Less than 1 in 10 trust the Congress that they elect. 90% of Americans say, I don't trust my Congress. But when you ask about mayors and city councilors in the United States, in Europe, and around the world, the trust levels go way back up, 60, 70, 75%. Even where they disagree with the mayor politically, they say, but he's okay. She's an okay woman. I trust her. She's trying. She's from the neighborhood. So trust levels, and trust is key to democracy, still work in cities. And if you look at the immigrants, if you look at the young people, if you look at the single mothers who no longer believe in democracy in their national societies, we can find new hope for them in the cities. That's why we have to make cities work for our immigrant populations, old and new, and for the refugees who come, because they will test in their minds whether democracy is real by how well the cities they live in work. And if they are included and become part of them and are considered citizens, they will believe in democracy, and if they don't, they will give up the dream. So cities offer us not just the chance for global governance and solving our global problems, but give us the chance for a renewal of democracy, something Europe needs and the world needs. So those of you sitting in this room today have a gigantic responsibility. I know when I say mayors and city councilors and cities should rule the world, it sounds nice, but it's a lot of work. Many mayors have said, I haven't got the time to govern my own city. Now you want me to govern the world? Really? But my answer is, if you don't govern the world, your own city will become ungovernable, because the two things go hand in hand. So you have that responsibility, but you also have that right. It is your right on behalf of your cities to make sure that global problems are solved in the interest of humanity, that justice, that peace, and that sustainability are achieved. And there is no indication that nations can do it. There is every indication that cities, that you can do it. I hope you will. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think you should stay with your microphone, and I should probably stay a bit away from it. You started out talking about the size of Denmark, we being very small, half the size of New York. Wouldn't you say that in the case of Denmark, it wouldn't make a lot of difference if mayors ruled Denmark because we're just too small for that to make a difference?
Well, that's a good question to ask the audience, not to ask me, but from what I've heard, even in the discussion today about the tensions between the national government and the local administration, about the discussion of resources and how they are allocated and who allocates them, I think there is a reason to devolve more and to make sure that cities have a right to the jurisdiction and resources they need to govern. And I think that has to be handled not as a matter of a request to a national government, but as a demand for the right to have the resources and jurisdiction to self-govern. Having said that, it's clear that Denmark is a great place on this issue as compared to some other places, but that's a good reason why perhaps Denmark can become a model for other parts of Europe of how cities and a national government can really work together, how the political parties that are in this room can soften their ideology and cooperate with one another. So Denmark still faces a challenge, but it can be a model.
But if size is an issue and we're only 5 million people, being pragmatic and close to the problems, wouldn't it be easier for a Danish government to be close to the problems than it would for a mayor of a city of 25 million people?
Let's see, 5 million people in a stadium, 5 million people in an arena, 5 million people in the Agora, the ancient polis, 5 million people in the ancient polis. It doesn't work. The optimal size for a public gathering is probably somewhere between 500 and 20,000, not more than that. The optimal size for a community that's really capable of self-government and direct democracy is probably 50 to 100, maybe 150,000. Take the wonderful example of participatory budgeting, an idea that came out of Porto Alegre 20, 30 years ago, in which Denmark and other cities, Danish cities, are using European cities, American cities. Participatory budgeting at a city level says we will take 5% or 10% of our budget and turn it over to districts and to the citizens and let them decide how to spend it. Now, Even with only 5 million people, is the Danish government really going to turn 10% of the Danish budget over to its citizens and say, you decide how to do it? I doubt it. The bureaucracy, the level of government is simply too high. So there is a great virtue. And in Denmark, what's interesting, America is a big country. It has very big cities. Denmark is a small country, and it has small cities. And the small, because even Copenhagen is, what, 500,000 people with the greater, 1.1 if you include everything in greater Copenhagen. It's relatively small, and every other city is under 250, 300,000. That's a great size to get things done. So, no, there's no reason why in Denmark also the cities should not be the primary engines of change, of meeting the challenges of the 21st century. And if they can do it with the national government, that's great. But whether or not the national government is there, they can do it.
But what then if they disagree? I mean, if they have to share tax income as they do today between the rich and the poor, and they disagree on how to share the money, what then?
Well, that's a good question, and let me say one question a lot of people ask me is, well, if cities take the place of states, won't they then become the quarreling, ideological entities that states are? You're just substituting one corrupt regime for another, a little smaller to be sure, but you'll have the same problems, won't you? And in a way, your question is a good version of that. But let me say there's a fundamental distinction between the city and the state. States are territorial, and they are non-zero-sum games, which means if Germany gets bigger, Denmark gets smaller, or Poland gets smaller. But Copenhagen and Warsaw and Berlin can all flourish. That Warsaw builds a great opera company, or Denmark has a marvelous dance company, as it does, doesn't mean that then Berlin can't have a good dance company. The competition among cities is a positive competition. We learned that from the Hansa. 1,000 years ago, the cities along the North Sea created an association, the Hansa League, in which they cooperated at the same time that the little principalities they belonged to were fighting one another. Cities have a knack for cooperation. They're interdependent, they're transactional, they're associational, they're about transportation, they're about culture, they're about diversity, they're about creativity, and that makes them more prone to cooperation than nation states that are about territory and about monocultural nationalism. That doesn't mean that there won't be competition. That doesn't mean there won't be agreement. Of course there were. We human beings disagree. We have different interests, and those have to be fought out. That's what politics is about. If we agreed on everything, we wouldn't have politics. It would just happen naturally. But the question is not, will cities always be cooperative, but what is a better basis for global cooperation? Warring territorial nation states that have proved for 400 years war is their primary instrument of transaction, or cities who for 400 years or 1,000 years have proved that trade and culture and movement and mobility is their best basis for cooperation. So with that in mind, I'll pick cities every time as my instruments of global cooperation over states.
But when cities rival, you could have a situation where capitals of the Scandinavian countries rival for a new airport or being an airport hub or something like that. When they rival, won't the big cities always dominate the small and the small become losers?
Will big cities dominate the small? They won't. And they won't because demographically and economically, the great engine of the world is not megacities. It's not New York, Tokyo, London, or Buenos Aires, or Rio, or Mexico City, or Jakarta, or Tokyo. It is the mid-sized cities where the majority of the urban population live, and where the majority of jobs are, and where the majority of patents, and where universities and culture are. It is mid-sized cities, and I mean cities between 150 or 250,000 and maybe 2 million. That's where most people want to live. If you ask me, what's your ideal city? Well, in Denmark, they might say Copenhagen, but a lot would say Aarhus. In France, they might say Paris, but a lot would say Nancy or Aix-en-Provence. And in Spain, a lot would say Barcelona or Bilbao, not necessarily Madrid. In the United States, they would say Louisville and Seattle, not necessarily New York. Because it's middling cities, big enough to have culture and opera houses and a university and diversity, but small enough not to represent a nation in a city, with 30 million people that really dominate. So certainly it's those cities that ought to be in charge, and in the global mayor of parliament, we are going to have a representation system that guarantees that mid-sized cities will be in the majority and that the very large cities do not dominate. I am a great fan of Mayor Bloomberg, but you will notice Mayor Bloomberg is not a sponsor of the global mayor's parliament, because we don't want this to be a New York or London, Boris Johnson dominated. We want cities like Aarhus and Graz and Metz and Mannheim in Europe to be the key cities in the global parliament of mayors, and not Paris, London, and Rome.
If we turn to mayors, you speak about mayors of cities as somewhat of heroes. They're pragmatic, they're from the neighborhood, they take the citizens' troubles seriously as opposed to nation states. But are there mayors who should definitely not be put in charge of ruling the world? And who are they?
We're talking about human beings. There are no perfect human beings. There are no politicians among whom we cannot find people who are corrupt and backward. Sometimes when I say if mayors rule the world, people say Detroit, but other people say Toronto. You all know Rob Ford, the drug-addicted mayor there. There are more New Jersey mayors, ex-New Jersey mayors in jail than in office today. So yes, of course, mayors are human. There are plenty of problems. But again, it's always as compared to what? The reason New Jersey's mayors are in jail but presidents aren't is that you can't arrest a president. You can still arrest a mayor and put him in jail.
Good point.
So in all seriousness, obviously there's a great variety and so on, but across the board, my experience has been, and I've spent my life studying political leaders at the national level, I've worked with presidents, I've worked with mayors. My experience is that the mayor is a very special kind of officer and has many of the qualities that make for democratic governance. There are corrupt ones, there are inadequate ones, there are stupid ones, but as a whole, I would much rather trust the fate of the globe with mayors than with prime ministers and presidents, yes.
So, if you could give a good piece of advice to the Prime Minister of Denmark who's sitting on the front row, what should she do in order to harvest these benefits from all these wise mayors?
Well, it sounds like she's already doing it from what I know, which is to say she is empowering cities, she is involving cities, that cities, I mean, as we've said over and over again, and we heard this morning, I don't really want to be a critic here because Denmark is one of those places where cities clearly play a very important role, not just in local governance, but in national governance, and that's as it should be. But all I would say to her is, do it more.
And one final question. Looking forward, as you see it, would we just be better off if we just took nation states and shut them down and put a for sale sign on the door?
That's a great question, and let me say two things. That's never going to happen. And secondly, it shouldn't happen. There are many functions that nations can and do play that are important. There are functions of a national transportation system, of national defense, of national communications. There are, of course, all kinds of important things that have to do with the coordination of cities that only states can do. So states aren't going away. Sovereignty is not going away. We need nation states, but nation states need a lot of help. And they have that help, if they welcome it, from their municipalities. And I am not arguing that cities should replace states. I am arguing that cities should have an opportunity alongside states to govern both internally and to govern the world, and to have the resources and the jurisdictional authority to do it. And nation states can make clear how important they are by helping facilitate and empower cities to do this work. And I think that is the objective, as I understood it from Minister Østergaard and from the Prime Minister. I think that is the objective of the Danish government, to empower cities to make that possible, to work with cities as equal partners, not as subsidiaries, not as local units of national administration, but as equal partners in the business of democratic governance and in the business of solving the world's problems. And let me just maybe end with this point. I haven't said one word, but I want to say it when I end: urgency. We don't have the time for a 20-year experiment. We don't have the time when we look at the immigration quotas, with the refugee quotas, when we look at terrorism, when we look at global warming. We don't have the time to say, let's try this for 20 years and then we'll try something else. What we do now will be decisive. And that's why the time of cities is now, not tomorrow, not next week. The experiment has to begin today in order to avoid catastrophe tomorrow. And with that.
And on that note, thank you so much, Mr. Benjamin Barber. Og så er jeg sikker på, at de fleste herinde i salen kan gå glade og opløftet til frokost. Så skal vi være tilbage her igen kl. 13, og så må vi se, om glæden fortsætter. Der skal vi have en debat om, hvorvidt vi skal have undersøgt en fusion mellem KL og regionerne eller ej. Så vær tilbage kl. 13. Og husk, I kan stadig stille spørgsmål via appen. Dem får jeg vil meget gerne have dem. Så på gensyn om en times tid.